much again, Julian, for having accepted the invitation with generosity. And I hope we can have a kind of lively and illuminating talk. I mean, my questions hopefully are helpful. I really enjoyed the book. It's really, I mean, there is a lot going on in the book. So I know that my questions in the end are like reductive in the end. So so I have a very introductory note about you, and then we start with the questions. So correct me if I am wrong. So Julian Stallabrass is a British art historian, photographer, and curator. He was educated at Leighton Park School and the New College, Oxford University, where he studied PPE. He has written extensively and prolifically on contemporary art, photography, and the history of 20th century British art. He was a professor at the Cortland Institute of Art, University of London, and he left Cortland in 2022, I think. Mm-hmm. Among his books are Gargantua, Manufactured Mass Culture, Paris Pictured, Internet Art, The Online Clash of Culture and Commerce, Memory of Fire, Images of War and A War of Images, Contemporary Art, a very short introduction, and the book that we are going to talk about today, Killing for Show, Photography, War, and the Media in Vietnam and Iraq. So my first question, Julian, is that what brought you to writing on such a critical topic? And yeah, so what brought you to write about war and killing for show? I mean, yeah, if I'm not wrong, the book has almost over 200 images. Yeah, and they are really special images, I mean, if not graphic. So what brought you to write about it?
Well, it actually came out of a curatorial project I was doing years ago now, the 2008 Brighton photo biennial, which took the name of Memory of Fire. And so it took place during the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. My country, the UK, of course, was involved as a combatant nation, one of the attackers and invaders and occupiers of Iraq. So it seemed like a very urgent topic to be looking at. And also because the image of the war as filtered through the mass media seemed to me to be very partial, very censored often, and very much supportive of the invaders' side. So one of the things I set out to do in the Brighton Photo Biennial was to offer a series of exhibitions looking at different aspects of war photography, some of it done by soldiers, some of it done by amateurs, some done by professional photojournalists and artists, and to put them into contrast with each other, I suppose. At the center of the show, of the biennial, was this exhibition, Iraq Through the Lens of Vietnam, which was the beginning of the comparison in a sense. And after the biennial finished, well, I thought that I would write a book on the subject, and it's taken me a long time, unfortunately, but here it is finally.
Right. Thank you. So, I mean, the first paragraph of the book, Julian, reveals a gesture of politics, which becomes the title of the book, namely Killing for Show. What is this politics and this title, Killing for Show?
Yes, well, the book opens with a still from a video released by the Royal Air Force. Mm. And what it shows is a pickup truck in Iraq, in the crosshairs of a missile, about to be blown up. And of course, in the video, you see it being blown up.
Sorry, Julian, to interrupt you. I think it's because of your microphone. Sometimes it's like I don't hear you. Sometimes it's like on and off. So
okay. Let me just check the settings.
Perhaps, yeah. Or it might be because of my computer. I don't know, that sometimes it's not audible.
Yeah. I'll just sit a bit closer, I think.
That usually. Thank you. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's fine. So this Royal Air Force video shows a pickup truck being blown up in Iraq. And I point out the expense of sending, a fighter plane from Cyprus, burning, tens of thousands of pounds worth of fuel, and the expense of the missile, the very expensive smart missile, to blow up this, this truck, which has something mounted on the back, possibly a gun, difficult to tell. And it seemed to me that this was largely done as a gesture, a visible gesture, to say, here is the UK doing something, right, about this purported threat. But that it was mostly a visual spectacle and mostly a visual gesture, a kind of snuff movie, if you like, but produced by the state. And that seemed to me an extreme example of a lot of what we see through the media, which is of a supposedly virtuous exercise of state power to defend the state, to kill its enemies, and so on. Much of that, of course, goes on under wraps, in secret. We don't see what goes on. But especially as the war on terror, so-called, developed, we see a lot of this. And it also seems to me a very stark example of the kind of state of exception, the idea that the state can, on the theory of Carl Schmitt, draw lines around who sits inside and outside the law, in a way, and say, well, these people here in this video are sitting most certainly outside, and it's perfectly okay to blow them up. All right.
Right.
So that's the idea of killing for show. It's partly, as I say, the state choosing to show you its exercise of power, but it involves a number of paradoxes and contradictions and tensions, because, of course, these videos can be read, and photographs can be read against the grain and can rebound back on the state. And maybe we decide, after seeing enough of these things, that the state's exercise of power isn't virtuous or effective after all.
All right, right. Thank you. I mean, though you just analyze it in detail, these two different wars. You have, I mean, one of them is war against communism, and the other is wars against tyranny. One in Vietnam, the other in Iraq. Despite many differences, for instance, the element of color, or that I mean, the element of color which come to the photography and to the war in Iraq, and also the other factors, like, I mean, photojournalists in Iraq apparently didn't have the freedom to wander off. What is common between these two wars? Let's start with similarities.
Yes, there is a bit of color in both, I should say. I mean, there were color photography of Vietnam, of warfare in quite uncontrolled conditions was pioneered in Vietnam, especially by people like Larry Burroughs. So there is some remarkable color photography of the Vietnam War. But yes, what do they have in common? Well, the big thing, I suppose, and why I wanted to bring them together, is that unlike most wars, these are wars to which the media is invited to see this virtuous exercise of power that I talked about. So they are both very clearly wars in which killing for show is a big feature. They're meant to be both two object lessons in the exercise of global power and what happens if you oppose, the dominance of the United States. So obviously, if you were trying to stage a nationalist and socialist revolution, that's the punishment, in a sense, of Vietnam was an object lesson there. And similarly with the regime of Saddam Hussein. Yes, it's against dictatorship for sure, but it's also against a country that has flouted the will of the United States and indeed was doing things which were like trying to set up circulations of oil money outside the dollar regime and that kind of thing. So there are various reasons why they decide to go in and destroy that enemy. And then, although there are vast differences between them, there are certain elements that do recur. So, because both countries are invaded and occupied, in essence, then you get quite similar scenarios of these client governments, vast amounts of corruption and inefficiency. In both wars, the United States relies very much on its technological power and dominance, and often doesn't act very intelligently as a result. And because of a popular resistance against those forces, which grow in both countries, eventually you get a great deal of brutality directed against the civilian population.
Mm-hmm. Great. I mean, just before going and moving to the differences, I have a question about the question of genre. One of the characteristics of this laborious and conspicuous book is that it works across many photographic registers, including photojournalism, amateur photography, and let's say artistic photography. Could you talk about this variety of photos you have chosen to analyze, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it seems to me that, well, one of the things it does is to look at the sort of temporal contrast. So I think photojournalism, for instance, worked quite differently in Vietnam and in Iraq for reasons we'll probably come back to. But given for instance, the restrictions on photojournalism and the way it operated in Iraq, some of which were state imposed, but a lot was also to do with the conformity of the mass media. It seemed to me important to try to complement the limits of photojournalism with other kinds of images. And you can do that in various ways. I mean, one of them is to look at amateur imagery that the Iraqis make themselves, particularly civilians make themselves, and which speak in very eloquent ways about life under the occupation, for instance, or the behavior of the invading forces. But also about many mundane aspects of Iraqi life under occupation, which just don't get featured very much, certainly not in the Western mass media. Mm-hmm. So there are clearly things that you can see there, which you don't find in mainstream photojournalism. Equally, military images can show you things which you don't see in photojournalism. And sometimes they're quite revealing of the way in which propaganda is made and genres are stuck to. And then again, artists sometimes do things which, really lie outside the mainstream of documentary photography. So one thing that's often pointed to is so-called aftermath photography, although some of it's actually made while fighting's going on, but large-scale photography made with big cameras, made into very large prints destined for the museum, full of detail and richness of color and resolution, and often very slow, considered images, which show you things about the environment, I suppose, and about people's place within it sometimes. I'm thinking of people like Paul Seawright's work in Afghanistan, or Simon Norfolk in Afghanistan and Iraq, or Sophie Ristel-Weber after the first Iraq War, for instance, the Gulf War. So yes, you can. I think by juxtaposing this work, the contrast tells you something about each of the different segments. But also, as I say, it reveals things which each segment covers or does not cover.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. I mean, let's go to these the transformation or the change that you describe in the book. I mean, you investigate two open media wars, one in Vietnam and the other in Iraq. There a transformation is tract, I'm quoting you, the transformation of the media environment, technology, military strategy, and the conduct of politics as they bear upon public relation, imprisonment and killing, amateur image production, how the digital environment bears on collective memory, and finally, what all this implies for the working of democracy, end of quote. Can you please explain these interrelations that you describe?
Well, I can try. I mean, that's basically the task of the entire book, and it's quite a long book, as you know. So I think I'll just have to settle on one or two examples of that. But quite a good one, I guess, is the system of embedding photojournalists in Iraq, right?
Right.
So this system was part of a big innovation in the US military and in Pentagon thinking towards making the media, but not just the media, all information streams work for the military. It was called the Revolution in Military Affairs, and it's a sort of thorough integration of digitization and data management into the military. That was the idea. So journalism was one of those things which would be exploited under this system. So what they did was to offer embeds to journalists and photojournalists under quite strict conditions. And these weren't exactly conditions of censorship, although there were certain things that you shouldn't report, which were to do with operational movements and, for perfectly good military reasons, or to show the faces of the dead before their relatives were informed, that kind of thing. So understandable restrictions. But the idea was that you would go into an embed with a particular troop unit, and you would have to stick at it. Okay. So if you were a photojournalist, for instance, you'd be embedded maybe with one of these spearhead forces that were moving very rapidly into Iraq during the invasion. You weren't allowed to go off and talk to civilians, for instance. You weren't allowed to leave the unit. If you did so, the embed would be finished with, right? And they would, since they were hard to get and gave you access to spectacular and marketable battle footage, people were reluctant to do that. The effect was, and this was surely intended, was that very often those journalists and photojournalists who were embedded with those troops relied on them for their own safety, ate with them, lived with them. They came to identify very strongly with the individual members of those teams and with what they were there to do. So although there was, I argue in the book, some critical work, photojournalistic work that comes out of embeds, it wasn't entirely determining, but the strong trend was that those journalists accompanying the troops took the troops' perspective of what the war was about. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, Vietnam there were similarities in certain ways. It was more a system of mini embeds in a way. If you wanted access to the battlefield, then indeed you had to ride with the troops, whether it was with the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, or with US troops. But these, and again, a system of identification was encouraged through that. But you weren't restricted in the same way. If you wanted to go off and talk to civilians, or indeed if you wanted to spend a lot of time dwelling with civilians and talking with them and getting their perspective, there was nothing to stop you doing that, okay? And these embeds were very quick, usually. They were a day or two, and then you would be free to do something else, okay? So while military commanders were indeed courted and bribed and buttered up by photojournalists and journalists generally in Vietnam, there was much more freedom to do what you wanted. And as it became clear that the war was going very badly wrong, certain photojournalists took very full advantage of those freedoms, and what's more, had some prospect of getting their work published. And that's one of the big differences in Iraq, because although actually many photojournalists made interesting and critical pictures, the chances of getting them published in the mainstream media, particularly in the United States, was very small. There's a remarkable book by Michael Camber called Photography at War, which is basically a series of interviews with people who served in Iraq and took photographs there, and hundreds of very, very interesting images which never saw the light of day before this book was published.
Great, thank you. Right.
I mean, there are many, many other contrasts we could talk about, but obviously, but and I suppose the other thing to say is that sometimes there are photographic echoes across the wars, which are quite misleading, I think, in some ways. And there are various reasons for that. I mean, one is that I think that photojournalists, I mean, they're very committed people. They put themselves in danger to make the images that they do, but they're also in a very competitive industry, and they want to get their images seen. And one way to do that is to make images which look a bit like iconic images of the past. Mm-hmm. And so you do see photojournalists in Iraq making things which look like echoes of well-known Vietnam imagery, although the circumstances in which they're working are utterly different. So as I say, there are sort of some misleading visual parallels in some ways. And I think it's partly to do with the sheer number of images which are going over editors' desks. In Vietnam, it was a relatively small number of images could be sent by wire every night to be published in the newspapers the next day. In Iraq, there were no such restrictions, and thousands of images were flowing across the desks of picture editors. So those images, which were very strong graphically or had strong echoes of something which had been seen before, tended to stand out. And I think that starts to influence the production of photojournalists.
Right. But I mean, again, I have a very general question, I know, but was Iraq War another way of repeating, I mean, photography in Iraq War, another way of repeating Vietnam War in terms of photography, violence, and even resistance to war and violence?
Well, I think there were a lot of photojournalists who hoped in a way that it would be. I mean, I quote Andrea Bruce, a very remarkable photographer who served in Iraq over a number of years and was very committed to going back often to see what was taking place, despite the very considerable dangers of working there.
Sorry, I don't hear you sometimes. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay. So Andrea Bruce was wanting to go back to Iraq, and she says that one of the things she wants to do is to create those critical images that will end the war, in a sense. Right. It's a very noble and possibly a rather naive view of the power of photography, but one that comes out of the very critical work that was done in Vietnam. So there's a sense in which I think photojournalists are wishing that history might repeat itself in that way, although, of course, photography didn't end the war in Vietnam. It was rather the Vietnamese resistance that did that.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to interrupt you. I mean,
yeah, that's fine.
That's a very sort of challenging question for me. That's why I ask you. Is that, I mean, sometimes like these days when I find myself like overwhelmed with the images. Sometimes I ask myself, are really these photos taken in order to end the violence in Iran, or are they going to wage a war? I mean, it's a big dilemma. I mean, I can't really decide what's the intention there, especially when it is when it is like embodied also in this neoliberal media today, that they just want more likes and more shares and so on and so forth. So you don't know if they're going to end the war or they're going to wage the war.
Okay. But you're talking about the current situation now.
Yeah, sorry.
That's
I
just want
to highlight that's a very important question for me.
Yes. Well, absolutely. And it's that kind of thing, I suppose. As I was writing the book and researching the book, which is now some time ago, was just emergent. And I do point to some very interesting books that Thomas Dworzak, a Magnum photographer, did. He called them Instagram mine books. And so he went into open Instagram accounts, which were to do with the Ukraine-Russian conflict at the time of the invasion of Crimea some years ago now. And these books are these fascinating combinations of the things you would expect from Instagram. So pictures of people's lovers and food and pets and selfies and all the rest of it. But also lots of people posing with arms, corpses, burnt out buildings, various horrors, which the photographers have either merely seen or perhaps in some cases the things that they've done themselves, right? So it's absolutely clear with that kind of imagery that yes, these images are meant to perpetuate violence and hatred. Again, I suppose you can say, because this is another form of killing for show, not done by the state, but by ordinary people, that these images can also be used against those aims and can rebound against the people that take them. But yes, I mean, plainly what we've seen in recent years has been a great deal of the splitting of the public sphere, of the inculcation of dehumanizing images and words, of the encouragement of civil conflict pretty often. And these are coming about because of social media platforms in many ways, which have their own agendas, which are very different from state agendas. And like any other industry, these are sort of externalities, if you like, pollutions of sorts, which they're happy to emit for their short-term profit. And if civil conflict is a result of that, they don't care. They don't seem to care.
So finally, can we go that far and say that, or claim that, you can't have a final word on whether photography or a photographer is favoring violence or is acting against violence?
Well, I think that there may be distinctions between the intentions behind certain kinds of photographs and their use in the media, and then their reuse in social media. So it's pretty easy to point to photographers going right back to Vietnam and indeed before that, who are very enthusiastic about the war and want to see the West win, and are depicting violence in order, in some ways, to help, the US forces. So Eddie Adams, who took a notorious picture of an execution of a guerrilla suspect in the Tet Offensive. It's controversial because this man's hands are handcuffed behind his back when he's shot in the head by the head of the Saigon police. And Adams, he gloried in being able to take that image and having access to it, but he hated its political effect and the way it was used by the anti-war movement, because he was very, very pro-war. And he's certainly not the only one who is working in Vietnam for those purposes. Equally, there are a few overtly anti-imperialist and anti-US photographers working in Vietnam. But their work gets used in all sorts of ways, which again they don't necessarily control. So Philip Jones Griffiths, who was one of those, for instance, his work is published in color, for instance, by the Sunday Telegraph, which is a very conservative paper, and with captions which are not at all the kinds of captions that Griffiths would have written himself, I suppose. or Don McCullin, I think, who's a sort of liberal opponent of war in general, took very, very striking pictures at the Battle of Hue. But if you look at his famous story in the Sunday Times, again, it's very gung-ho. He didn't write those captions, but it's all to do with the bravery of Marines rather than anything else. So yes, images can be and have been and are regularly used to further the ends of violence and have been for a long time, as I write in that book. I suppose that what the book is trying to do, or one of its main aims, is to take those images, no matter where they come from, and to use them for anti-war and anti-imperialist purposes, and to show how they can be read in that.
Definitely, that's very clear in the book, and that's one facet that makes the book remarkably interesting. Just like somehow relevant to the last question is that, there are also local and actual killings for show, which have limited viewership. So again, my example is current. Is Iran. What happens as in Iran, and as you just mentioned, Instagram, if such photos have larger circulation, which is very possible in the age of neoliberalism. It's very possible, and
let's just try and get a sort of a track down the decades, if you like. Because people have very regularly taken photographs of atrocities, either because they oppose them or because they've committed them and they want a trophy, right? So in Vietnam, for instance, US soldiers very, very regularly took pictures with little Instamatic cameras, simple cameras, of the things that they did. And, then presumably there must be many, many thousands of these things still in shoeboxes under people's beds in the United States, right? But because they were prints, they have, and because once the war was over and their function changed, they were shared widely among troops, I think. But once the war was over, these things got hidden away and didn't circulate. And already, though, by Iraq, these images are made digitally, largely. And they do have another circulation. And this starts to worry the powers that be greatly, that they've lost control over the circulation of these things. And the famous example is Abu Ghraib, of course, the terrible prison that the Americans ran in Iraq, and where people were tortured indeed, in part by having their photographs taken in compromising positions for the purposes of blackmail and so on. And those images got out, and the Pentagon, despite strenuous efforts, could not control their circulation, and eventually there was a criminal investigation run by the military into what had gone on there. So Donald Rumsfeld complains about this. He says, how do we pursue warfare in these conditions where, we can't control the circulation of images? So it's already a threat. Well, the current circumstances, of course, are much more extreme than that, because you can take very good images on a mobile phone and you can circulate them immediately. It has lots of effects, this, plainly. One is to bolster resistance movements, as is happening in Iran at the moment. Another is because of this, very, very split and fractious and hostile media environment in many ways, is to increase photographic skepticism a good deal. So it's very possible to cast doubt over images that are circulated, that they show what they actually show. And of course, there are many agents at work, not least state agents, who are faking images and running false flag operations and all of those things. So, there are good reasons for skepticism often. But I think that, in the case of Iran, it's really fascinating that the state response is in some ways quite an old one, one which looks very much like sovereign power, which is to say, we will jail the journalists, right? Or we'll accuse them of treason. We will say this is all about foreign spying and manipulation of various kinds.
And what
so it
would
seems
be
to be.
Oh, sorry to drop.
Yeah, no, go on.
Just like curious to hear right now. I mean, what would be the updated reaction, or the controlled reaction? Let's say, not the sovereign state reaction.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Russia, for instance, I mean, there's a mix of that kind of reaction, which is certainly going on. But earlier in the Ukraine conflict and over many other issues, they seem to be content to throw vast amounts of chaff into the air, if you understand that term. So it's like when a missile locks onto a fighter plane, one of the things they can do is to release all this silvery, glittery stuff into the air, which confuses the sensors of the missile, and so that the jet escapes. And that seemed to be the Russian media model, and very effectively pursued over a number of years, to say, well, no, don't look at this, look over here instead, because there's something else going on which is more interesting, or to put out many competing and often patently absurd claims about an event in order to sort of muddy the waters, as it were, and distract people from clear condemnation of what's going on.
All right, so it's a method that is used and implemented now in the Russian war against Ukraine.
It is to some extent, but right. As I say, because of that war has gone so wrong. I mean, the other thing that the Russians are doing is absolutely persecuting journalists, changing the law so that you can't report critical stories, and jailing anti-war demonstrators, all of that. So there's hard power and this media manipulation going on at once.
Right. And I have a quite irrelevant question, which was like you just mentioned in the book, but caught my attention, is that what's the relation between what Juliette Michel calls the repression and photography of war?
Well, de-repression is not a term that I use, and I may be a little bit skeptical of it, in the sense that it implies that there are things in human nature which would make us content to murder and rape and torture and so on, and do all of these terrible things. But they're repressed, and that in war, what you get is a state of, a return to those savage conditions, I suppose you might say.
Sorry, I don't know why
let me just look at my
internet. I mean, I also sometimes have unstable internet, so it might be because of that. But sometimes I really hear you perfectly, and sometimes it's like cut. And
testing the microphone now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just change if it's any better.
It's now good. It's now, now it's better. Your image is frozen. Do you hear me? Do you hear me, Julian?
I can. The internet froze for a while, so okay. I've just changed one of the audio settings. We'll see if it's any better.
Now it's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. So shall I start that again, that bit?
Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. So the de-repression is not a term I use, and I'm a little bit skeptical of it because it I suppose, implies that there is propensity for extreme violence and cruelty in human nature, which is repressed by society, and that comes into the open in conditions of warfare. I don't think that's always true, and that different wars are very different, and I mean there are different levels of cruelty and torture and the use of sexual violence across wars. I mean, so that's important to say. But obviously, especially in Vietnam, but also quite regularly in Iraq, there were acts of extreme cruelty perpetuated by soldiers. And as I said before, they very often recorded them too, in different ways. And so I suppose that it's interesting to think about why it is that they do that. And I mean, I don't really know, I have to say. I mean, in a sense, there are, there's a very interesting book by Errol Morris and Philip Gurevich, where they look at Abu Ghraib, for instance, and they question the perpetrators that made these images quite closely. And, there are interesting things that come out of that book, but I am not totally sure that those people are going to tell you why it was that they did what they did, especially since they're the subject of criminal investigations and so on. So it may be very difficult to know exactly what those motivations are. I think some of it may be to do with an idea that it's psychologically comforting to control and frame those atrocities, having perpetuated them, having made them. There's something about the way that photography allows you to flatten something into an image, control its framing, strip away the noise, the stench, and put it in a box, in a sense. So that may be a part of it. And I think, too, something we touched on earlier, that these images are often shared within troop units. It's something to do with building solidarity, which is based on the committing crimes. And this was something certainly that was very often done in troop units in Vietnam, that new members were blooded, as they'd say. So they were made to commit crimes by other members of the troop. In order to...
Sorry, I have the same problem again.
Oh dear. All right, let me change it back. So new troops coming into a troop unit were blooded, as the term goes. So they were made to commit atrocities of various kinds, to bind them together into the unit. It's a sort of almost like a mafia type thing that everybody has to get their hands dirty, so that no one is likely to inform the authorities of the things that were done.
Right.
So,
one of the striking facets of the book is that you have provided plenty of photos and also try to constantly contextualize and analyze them. It seems that we are not able to see these photos as you quote Butler. I'm asking this question as a person who has been overwhelmed and even bombarded with the cruel and violent photos in the last weeks from Iran and what has been happening there. So there's a French philosopher I was reading last week, Marc Repon, in his book, The Trial of Hatred, he argues that, I'm quoting him, no explication will suffice to confront the inexplicable. The murder in cold blood of dozens of targeted and slaughtered individuals. End of quote. Do you think we always need some distance, some coldness to interpret and finally see such images?
Well, it's a very good question. And it's one that I struggled with a lot as I wrote the book. And even now, I'm not really sure what the effect of the book is exactly. And I'm sure it's different for different people. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the striking exhibits at the Brighton Photo Biennial, to go back to that, was a piece called The Incommensurable Banner by Thomas Herschel. And what he'd done was to create an enormous sort of do-it-yourself protest banner showing many images of extreme cruelty and blown apart bodies and so on. And it was very instructive to read the comments book for that exhibition. And also to observe people as they looked at this display. And I have to say that whereas most people were horrified, but also were saying, because this took place in the UK, and in that context, and in the context of the very controlled media that I was talking about before, that it did seem to be for many people a salutary exercise at saying, well, look at what we are doing, okay, and that there was a need in some ways to see those images. But equally, other people took it quite flippantly, or even enjoyed the images and re-photographed them for their own purposes, whatever. So there was a variety of responses. But I do think it's the answer may be very different depending on who you are. And I remember discussing this with Amna Malak, an art historian based in Britain, who said, I don't need to see any more images like this. Mm-hmm. I know that they exist. I know why they exist. I know what's going on. And, was rejecting, the idea that these things should be shown.
And what's her reason?
Well, I think that, the good reason in many ways that what you might be doing in re-showing such imagery is recreating the humiliations that surrounded the original events. I suppose my reply to her was to say, well, no, you don't need to see those things. You really do know what's going on. You have internalized all of this. But there are many people who have not. And I think that, as I say, particularly in the UK and in the US, in those nations that were involved directly in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, that there was and there remains, a need to show those people what was done by their governments, in their name. So that's what I've tried to do. But I fully admit that it's a really difficult and troubled situation, and that many people might have good reasons for objecting to the book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm just thinking loudly, just to say that sometimes, like, I spent 2 weeks in Iran last month, and once I was back to my life here, sometimes, I don't know, the fact that the Iranians who are there and recording what's happening there, like through photos or videos, and they expect us here to show them, are they expecting solidarity or they are perpetuating violence? I mean, so perhaps it is really too cold of me to go that far, but it's really very ambivalent.
Yeah.
I mean, that can be very contagious, like you want the photo to circulate more in social media, but it can also be read as a sign of solidarity or asking for solidarity. So
Yeah, indeed it can. I mean, this would be the argument of Ariel Azoulay, for instance, who would very often see such images as a claim to fundamental civic rights which are being violated by a state. And Iran would be an excellent example of that at the moment. And again, there are circumstances in which those images can operate that way. But I think we should also be very aware that they can be used for the opposite ends too. And indeed, the book does explore the use of images to intimidate. And that's another aspect of Killing the Show, plainly. So the shock and awe attack on which opened the Iraq War was a very plain example of that. It's supposed to terrify Iraqi civilians and the military, to make them realize that it was futile to fight such a display of force.
Sorry, again, I have hard time hearing. Yeah.
That it was useless to, to fight against such a use of military force and such a kind of extravagant, barrage of bombs and missiles and so on. And indeed, it was quite effective. This is a very good example of the idea of images as a force multiplier, which work for the Pentagon's purposes. And so many Iraqi troops, very sensibly, decided that they were not going to fight for the regime and abandoned their ancient tanks and fled. But this was absolutely something which was very much to do with the speed of the media in Iraq too. That these images could be seen almost immediately and have an immediate effect on battlefield conditions.
Yeah, thank you. I think I have like 2 questions left.
Sure.
So one of the issues you address in the book is memory and flashbulb memory. You even highlight the role of memory in brain studies and its relation to photos. In a section, you say, I quote you, memory should be thought of as a continual reconstruction rather than a recording. Yeah. Memories are not laid down once and for all, but through a process of repetition and rehearsal that continually alters them. End of quote. As a result of such functioning, some images or memories are disappeared when they are not repeated, and some, when constantly repeated, become consolidated and become what you call resistant to erasure. What is this link? And I would be really thankful if you elaborate on that. Can it be regarded as an aesthetic maneuvering of ideology today? I mean, through this repetition and reconstruction and consolidation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the aims of the book was to get away from the psychoanalytic methods of analyzing memory, and especially the rather comforting Freudian idea, in a sense, that we don't forget anything. It's all there somewhere, and that with sufficient analysis and so on, you can unearth it. Whereas modern brain science does not say that, but as you accurately say, says that you need to rehearse memories to keep them, and that if you don't, they vanish, and they vanish for good, right? And so one of the implications of that is that the mainstream media can very powerfully frame both individual and collective memory through repetition and omission. Okay. And I mean, one of the striking things about photographing the book, about researching the book and finding photographs to illustrate, was that some photographs which once had been quite well known, especially photographs that were circulated, for instance, in the old Soviet bloc, have almost disappeared. Very, very difficult to find. And yes, there's a repression there, I suppose, or forgetting. And it was interesting to try and recover some of those things. So social media obviously is less controlled in terms of, the pushing of particular state and mass media ideologies. But nevertheless, there are very sophisticated and individually tailored kind of mental manipulations going on through these secret algorithms, which are directed against us. And as we touched on before, towards a rather disruptive public sphere, in which all kinds of emotions are harnessed to bind viewers to those platforms, so as to take profit. And in all this, yes, aesthetics and ideology are really strongly linked, I think. I mean, one thing that's very much in the minds of people in the UK at the moment is think about the spectacle of the royal family and all that went on during the Queen's funeral, and will go on again with the coronation of the new king. It's a very clear case in which ideology and aesthetics comes together in spectacle in all these sort of very elaborate and invented traditions, which they claim go back to, the Middle Ages or further, but are very often either 19th century inventions or even newer than that.
True. Thank you. And Julian, when I look at the book, somehow you have been discussing sort of genealogy of photography of war. I mean, there is this kind of evolution, this kind of change, transformation. But the same transformation and the same evolution has also been happening in terms of war. We have new forms of war.
Yes.
And one example is that in his book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, Nicholas Mulder introduces sanctions as a new mode of war in a historical context. Can we argue that there are new modes of violence that cannot be easily captured and photographed?
Yes, and sanctions are a really good example. And of course, they were applied against Iraq for over a decade before the invasion and occupation took place, and with terrible effects. I mean, these were very drastic sanctions. I think the US boasted at the time that there had never been sanctions as extreme as those that were directed against Iraq. And people starved. Millions of people became sick and died. The infrastructure which had been destroyed during the Gulf War was very hard to fix as a result of these sanctions. So they had truly terrible effects, and they did weaken the state as well very severely. So that when the invasion took place, it was against a nation and a state that had been kind of hollowed out from the inside. And all of that is quite difficult to show photographically. Photography is often better at recording effects than causes, for instance, and better at recording things that happen quickly than happen slowly. But that said, it's not impossible to do such things. And Philip Jones Griffiths, who I mentioned before, was able to, through careful consideration and the building up of long sequences of images and seeing them work together, was able to show some of the structural things that were going on in Vietnam, including the growth of urban slums, for instance, dislocation of people from the land, the use of strategic hamlets, these sort of slower aspects of the war which took place alongside the faster and more spectacular elements. And there were other photographers who did similar things. And if one thinks about Iraq, I mean, one of the things that Bruno Stevens does, for instance, when he goes to photograph, and he enters Iraq before the invasion takes place, and has striking pictures of civilian life. But one of the things he does, for instance, is to photograph the children's graveyards. and the thousands upon thousands of Iraqi children who, often very young children, who died because they weren't getting sufficient food or clean water or medicines to cure common diseases. So that's one way that he does that. One might think of Hayth Abdel Ahad, a very remarkable Iraqi photojournalist and writer, who in his work for The Guardian makes these very moving pictures of these deeper issues about Iraqi life under occupation, and exploring, those longer term issues, whether it be to do with education or malnutrition or, other forms of collapsing infrastructure, these kinds of things. So it can be done. It should be done, of course. It's a question, again, of whether you can get it published.
Yeah, sure. My last question, Julian, is that I'm quoting you: capitalism and its states kill fast and slow. The slow forms such as air pollution or inculcating addictions to sugar and cigarette take decades. The medium rate forms such as sanctions, months or years, warfare otherwise an extension of politics. Is unique only in its speed and visibility, which brings state power into view in all its nakedness and ruthlessness. End of quote. Again, I will be thankful if you explain this and tell if it makes any difference if we are talking about different societies. Just you mentioned like sovereign society, or let's say disciplinary, or what once was called society of control. Does it make any difference when we just take such factors into consideration?
Yes. Okay. I mean, it's a fascinating question, and you challenged me to think about it. I think that I'm a little bit skeptical of the move from sovereign societies to disciplinary societies to control societies. I think that very often, at least that these changes are not very sharp, and that often all of these things are going on at once. Okay, so I was looking back in a blog I've been writing recently about photographs I took 40 years ago at a coking plant, a smokeless fuel plant in a region of Wales where I was living at the time, which emitted vast amounts of pollution, killing off the plants nearby, destroying people's health, especially those of the workers, but also those who lived in the vicinity. And it seemed to me at the time to be a very clear example of sovereign state power to say, this thing is going to sit here and it will kill you slowly, right? Or at least it will, if that doesn't kill you, it's going to damage your health very, very clearly. And there's nothing you can do about it, all right? This thing will be protected by the police if necessary. And obviously warfare is an example of sovereign power in a very naked form. And the army as well. Yeah, I mean, there are disciplinary elements to do with surveillance and internalization in army training, but in the end, an order is an order, and you will do as you are told. And there are plainly, many examples of sovereign warfare. The First World War would be a very good example. So, the British forces, and not just them, they go over the top for an attack across the trenches, and the officers are behind them, some officers anyway, with pistols. And if you run away, they'll shoot you down. Okay, so that's a very naked form of sovereign power. And what went on in the regime of Saddam Hussein, is largely sovereign power of that kind as well. I think, especially as it starts to fall into, it starts to collapse. It's outright and naked repression. There is a way of seeing Vietnam as, I guess, a failed imposition of a disciplinary society in Michel Foucault's sense, an idea that we will impose on you at the point of a gun consumerism, urban life, nuclear families. We will force you away from the lands of your ancestors and that kind of deep, long-term attachment to the land and to the worship of those who went before you, all of that. And this was a part of what went on in Vietnam, as well as it being a kind of global object lesson in power relations, a failed one, of course, at the time at least. And you might see, I guess, Iraq as a control society war in certain ways, in that it was meant to be a neoliberal way of fighting war. It was meant to be a cheap, quick, very individualist way of waging war, in which individual troop units were given lots of autonomy, for instance, especially the special forces and so on. And it was heavily informational, based on this revolutionary military affairs, which we discussed, and to do with the manipulation of information from moment to moment. So there's a way in which you could see that as a control society war. But again, it's a colossal failure, right? It doesn't work at all in the end. Sure, that they're able to destroy Saddam's regime and his, incredibly antique authoritarian army. That happens. But in terms of building alternative institutions, infrastructure, it all founders in colossal amounts of incompetence and corruption. They're not really able to build anything. And what you get instead is anarchy and spiraling of the nation into civil war, complete failure of the system. So I guess that's what I would say about the different regimes of warfare and fast and slow.
Do you have any final comment about the current Russian-Ukraine war, like in terms of control societies, or how the media represents that?
Yeah, well, I mean, in certain ways, it's a return to an old style of war fighting, which we haven't seen for quite a long time, right? So, I mean, one of the things I write about in the book is the decline of these large-scale wars, particularly between relatively even matched opponents. And one of the last examples is the Iran-Iraq war, which was fought for so long, over 8 years, I think, with a million or so casualties and no good result for anybody, right? So it's just destruction on either side. So it wasn't exactly encouraging people to do this sort of thing again. And wars since have more often been civil wars, very lengthy, many of them not large, without large military engagements, more to do with the oppression and exploitation of civilian groups and resources, and often done without very much media scrutiny as well. So, but the invasion of Ukraine, does return us to something, not seen for a long time, especially because it turns out that the two countries are more evenly matched than one might have imagined. So that's one side to it. But the other thing I think that is going on, which is very remarkable, is that many of those wars, the civil wars that I described before, and following Iraq, which became very, very hostile to Western media in particular, but to all media really, is that photojournalism was suppressed really by violence and the dangers of covering the war. Whereas in Ukraine, what you have is both this old style warfare and a very sophisticated, media-friendly population in Ukraine who are welcoming photojournalists in from all over the world, see that they clearly are working in their interests and are anxious to work with them. And on top of that, of course, you've got the whole social media environment. So it is a remarkable and very new opportunity for photojournalism to show what it can do, I suppose.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Julian. That was wonderful, both reading the book, talking to you, and even now I learned a lot. That was wonderful, and I wish I had more time to talk more, but it's like already I asked many questions. I hope I can read more books of yours and come back to you sometime again.
That would be great. And thank you for such interesting questions. They really
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Have a great evening and a great weekend.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.